Hi, everybody, and welcome to Circle of Fellows, the broadcast where IABC Fellows get together and talk about the IABC editorial theme of the month. We have half a circle, a semicircle today. George McGrath and Ned Lundquist are here. Ned, one of the 2016 class of Fellows, so really thrilled to have you on board, Ned. Welcome to both the Fellows and
Thank you,
the
Shel.
show. We'll do introductions in just a minute. We are also supposed to have Jim Lukaszewski and John Gerstner with us. John is in a hotel in Tampa, and he was with us for a little bit over his phone and then dropped off. So I suspect that he'll try to figure out a way to get back onto the Hangout. And Jim, I hope will be able to join us at some point during this, but we're scheduled for noon Eastern, and it is, so we'll get started. There are two very experienced communicators on the broadcast right now in Ned and George, and I'm sure we can have a great conversation. So welcome to both of you. Why don't you both just give yourselves brief introductions so that people who are watching can, if they don't already know you, find out a little bit about your background. George?
Yeah, I'm George McGrath. I'm a communications consultant based in New York City. About 30 years in the business, and among other things, during my career I've done a lot of work with companies on issues management and corporate social responsibility programs. So I'm very much looking forward to today's topic.
Yeah, it is a fascinating topic and one I've been talking about a lot the last couple of years. Ned, how about you?
Well, Shel, I'm a retired naval officer. I retired from the Navy after 24 years in 2000, and since then have been working in corporate communications and strategic communications for both commercial, a not-for-profit, and government clients. Currently working for a defense contractor called MCR, where I am a principal science writer working for government clients, and I also LLC, where I'm servicing my commercial clients and doing program outreach and advocacy.
Excellent. So for the last couple of months we have been, as I mentioned, adhering to the editorial theme for the International Association of Business Communicators, which changes monthly. And this month the theme is social issue and development communication. Specifically, according to the editorial calendar, communicating transparently about how your organization makes an impact on social and environmental issues and making those issues come alive for audiences has become a crucial part of your brand's identity. This issue will cover the importance of being a good corporate citizen through sustainability practices, job creation, community philanthropy, and how to communicate these benefits to the public as well as to specific stakeholders. There's a part of that that I think is of real interest to people right now. I heard some people at the World Conference in New Orleans lamenting that there wasn't a session on what was going on in North Carolina, with a lot of companies signing on to their opposition to the transgender bathroom law that had been enacted there. Everybody probably knows that the All-Star game for 2017 has been moved out of Charlotte because of this law. But you have Salesforce.com and a lot of other organizations that have been very vocal in their opposition to the law, and I think communicators are wondering what they're supposed to do and how this is affecting their organizations. There's a lot of research that supports the idea that companies should be doing this, notably the Edelman Trust Barometer. The Trust Barometer has been very clear this year that people think that companies should be using some of their profit to make the world a better place. In his book, Trust Me, PR is Dead, I'm trying to remember the name of the author of this book, Robert Phillips, former president of Edelman EMEA, talked about what he called conscious capitalism, with organizations devoting some of their profit to social justice causes, not just sustainability causes. So let's kick off a conversation about this with the three of us. I also wanted to make the point before we jumped into it, though, that Richard Edelman, CEO of the Edelman organization, wrote a blog post saying it is time for CEOs to get social. He pointed to the era of the celebrity CEO. We had Jack Welch and people like that. Most recently, we have been in the era of the anonymous CEO, but he says now CEOs have to be social, representing their organizations and their organizations' positions, particularly around social issues, through social channels. And he pointed to some examples of CEOs who have Facebook presence and use that presence to articulate the company's point of view. Is this something we let CEOs do on their own? Is this a place for communicators to get engaged? Where do you fall on this? And I know, George, you've done counseling on this type of thing.
You know, it really depends on the CEO and the organization. There are a lot of CEOs who are actively engaged with social media, and particularly on corporate social responsibility issues. I mean, the CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, is a great example. He's doing a lot on sustainability online, both on Facebook and Twitter, talking about what the company's been doing, both internally and in engagement with their stakeholders. So, you know, the CEO is motivated and has got the time to tweet himself or herself. All the more power to them. Or it could be a role where the communications group is going to be supportive of that as well. So we see it going both ways. And then, of course, it's not just the CEO. There's other people in the organization who are going to be out there active on social media as well. On sustainability issues, you may have a sustainability director, or it could be who's tweeting on what you're doing on a sustainable supply chain. It could be people in your sales groups. So the biggest challenge probably is not just engaging people in being in social media, but making sure you got a coordinated message on it, particularly on these social issues.
Ned, want to jump in on that?
I think that when we go back to the beginning of this, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the whole thing starts with core values. An organization has to have core values. The organization, the members of the organization need to understand what those core values are and need to accept them, need to embrace them. So I think that trying to communicate your social responsibility is rather hollow unless it's based on unless it's value based and with a strong value based foundation. The second thing I would add is that I think some people might view tweeting or social media, particularly with your CEO, as a one-way thing. And excellent communications is symmetrical. It's two-way, and the communications team needs to be listening and needs to be feeding that information back up through management and through leadership, so that they understand where the organization stands or how a message is resonating. And sometimes before you start doing some kind of corporate social responsibility or some kind of outreach, I think it's important to start with some research to know what's your benchmark and where your organization is perceived now, and have some objective about what you want to do, rather than just let's do a service project or let's communicate about how concerned we are. Maybe some research about what resonates with your target audience and where you might want to do your advocacy. And then after you take all that into consideration, then there's also the issue of it's not just a socially responsible thing to do, but it contributes to the bottom line. Companies that are well managed, that are based, that have this foundational core value base upon which they operate, which practice it does make for a more successful organization.
I think, I'm a big believer in research for communications in general. I think some organizations are facing a situation where government does something and they need to react in a heartbeat. I'm thinking in Arkansas, where the religious liberty law had passed the legislature and was moving to the governor's desk. And Walmart issued a statement in a heartbeat, basically saying, we oppose this. I believe this was consistent with their values, which is inclusion. So I don't think they had to get together and talk about, well, do our values align with making a statement in opposition to a law that is perceived as discriminatory. But on the other hand, I think they ran the risk of alienating people who were perhaps supporters of that law. Yeah, this is something I've seen a bunch. I know that Wells Fargo, the bank, ran a TV commercial that showed a same-sex couple with their child, and the organization that was run by, I can't even remember, Billy Graham's organization, now run by his son, Franklin Graham, withdrew all of their money, millions of dollars from Wells Fargo, and put it in another bank. I found it amusing that the bank they put it in, one local to them, is also one that supports the local gay pride parade, but be that as it may, there was some publicity targeting Wells Fargo over the fact that in opposition to this TV commercial, the organization took its business elsewhere and encouraged its members to do the same. So it seems that there's a certain amount of risk involved in taking social issues, because part of your audience may disagree with it, and it could have an impact on your business. Is there a role for us to counsel leaders on these types of actions, at least to prepare them for some consequences that they may not be anticipating?
Well, absolutely, yes. I think a lot of it goes back to the point that Ed was touching on just a couple of minutes ago, which is that it all starts with the values of your organization and how you believe in treating people within your own organization. It goes out from there, and I think a lot of the companies that have been involved taking positions on some of the legislation you referenced in Arkansas, Georgia, North Carolina, and elsewhere are really acting out of their own value system and out of their own policies of inclusion as a company. And so you've got to be consistent with what you're doing internally and externally. I mean, we can't have one message to our own employees saying we value inclusion internally and then stay mum on things that are happening in the outside world that go against that value. And it's always going to be a balancing act for the company. I think a lot of the reaction you get depends on how visible your company is. A lot of the, if it's a Target, for example, on the bathroom access issue, they got a lot of attention, a lot of heat on it when they came out and said, basically, we think people can use the bathrooms in our stores based on, how the ones they feel are appropriate for themselves to use. That was a position that was welcomed by a lot of people, and it was opposed by a lot of people because it's a real hot button issue. There's been a little bit less heat around the legislative issues, it seems to me, just because it's more diffused. There's a lot more companies involved in it, so no one company is kind of sticking out and being, no pun intended, the target. But there's definitely a role for us as communicators looking at the experience of other companies to say, okay, if we're taking a position on an issue, these are the things you have to be prepared to deal with. And it seems to me that communicators have got a critical role as part of that process.
When you're looking at these types of issues that are about to land on the governor's desk, I would hope that the government relations department in that organization, in Walmart, for example, or Wells Fargo, would know and perhaps be trying to engage with the state government or whoever in order to say that this is what we think might happen if this law is signed into effect. And so there, one, there's the opportunity to engage, and two, there's obviously the opportunity to inform leadership, make them aware, so that you're not reacting, you're being somewhat proactive. Reacting is, to me, is never the best way to respond to a situation. It's always better to have kind of a heads up and be prepared. In some of these social issues, I don't want to mention any by name, but some of them really aren't that much of an issue, but there are extremes, either very much for that issue or very much against it, who are co-opting the issue, and companies can get stuck in the middle. It can get caught in the crossfire, and I'm not sure what the answer is, because each issue, of course, is in and of itself, a separate thing. But I think a lot of times there are people who can grab an issue and run away with it for their own, for their cause, that can get companies caught up in that. I think if you have the opportunity to be prepared, to have thought through this in advance, you don't look like being a reactionary, but you want to be thoughtful and careful on how you respond to those types of situations.
Yeah, I want to come back to the issue of corporate value alignment, because I think there's an internal communication component to this. But I want to talk about the alignment of the issue with the organization's interest, because George, you shared an article with us that I had seen earlier. It was a Weber Shandwick study on all of this, and what it said, and we'll talk about some of the other findings from the study, but people saw CEOs more favorably if they took a public stance on a hotly debated current issue, if there was some connection between the organization and that issue. But if they felt that the issue was wholly unrelated to the business of the company, those results were reversed. They didn't have a favorable view. So let's go back to North Carolina and the transgender issue. I think there are some organizations that had skin in the game, basically because they retail operations with outlets in North Carolina and customers coming in and using public restrooms. On the other hand, you have Salesforce.com, which Mark Benioff, the CEO, has been referred to by some opponents of all of this as being a ringleader. You might wonder where Salesforce has an issue, but they were planning on opening an office and employing, I think it was 400 people. Is that too tenuous a connection in order to take a very public leadership type of position on one of these social issues, or do you need to have a firmer connection to the issue? I mean, I haven't seen how people in general have responded to Salesforce involvement, but it seems that we were going to open an office there. It isn't quite as strong a connection as thousands of people come to our stores there every day.
Yeah, and I think the other question is, well, we're not going to open an office we're not opening an office in a particular state, which has passed some legislation we think is discriminatory, but we'll do business in countries where they've got long-established laws that are even more intense. So I think you always got to be careful when you go into these things, and this is where I think communicators come in, to look inside at your own operations and say, wait a minute, before we get up on a soapbox and start preaching to others, is our act totally buttoned up everywhere we do business? And if there's some inconsistencies, can we explain them? I think some things are explainable if you say, look, we've had a decision whether we're going to actually expand in a market or area or not. That seems a little bit different than, are we reconsidering everything where we've already got an established business? But you got to do a pretty careful scan on those things, because your opponents on an issue, people who take the opposite side, are going to be very quick to do their due diligence online and accuse you of hypocrisy.
Yeah, I think sometimes you're going to have a situation where people are responding to something that initially sounds really bad, but if you really look at the facts, that maybe the situation is not exactly as it might be portrayed. That's why you really need to study these things before you respond, understand really what the law calls for. And then, of course, I think what George was sort of referring to there is there are second and third order effects. And so making a stand on one thing might sort of call into question maybe your stand on something else, or your involvement with another country or something like that. So I think that's really important too. Shel, you sort of mentioned connecting the cause with the business, and I think that that can be can be done appropriately, and it can be very valuable. An example, and this may not be the best example, but I remember reading about a company that made a effort to teach children how to wash their hands to improve. And the idea was, kids get to come into the class at the school, and they're all taught the right way to wash their hands, and they're given soap. Of course, that's good for the business, right? Unilever makes soap. And this is seen as improving sanitation. But there was also a real reason that the company started this, and we'll go back to research, right? The problem was there was a Unilever manufacturing facility near this area where they were doing this teach your kids how to wash their hands. And productivity was down. And when they did their research, they did their analysis, they found that productivity was down because absenteeism was down, was up. People were missing work. And they found out that people were missing work because they were going to their kids who were home from school. And the kids were home from school because they were sick. And they were sick because they were getting dysentery or diarrhea because of poor sanitation. So you go back and you analyze all of this, and you realize if we could improve the sanitation of the children at school, then they would have a higher attendance rate at school, which would reduce the absenteeism at work, which would contribute ultimately to the success of that manufacturing facility. So there's lots of good reasons to do good things.
Well, how important is it then to share that research? I mean, one of the issues that was raised in the description of this editorial topic for the month, this theme, is transparency. So do you just roll out the hand-washing campaign, or do you go to great pains to explain that connection?
Well, to me, the connection is... I mean, it makes a lot of sense, and it's to everyone's benefit. There's nothing nefarious behind it. So I think that, yeah, the transparency here is really important. So, yeah, you don't want people to think, oh, they don't really care about me. They're just trying to make more money. If you're very upfront about this is good for all of us, and here's why, then I agree. So the transparency is critical here.
Right. And Jim Lukaszewski has joined us. Hi, Jim.
Hi there. How you doing, guys? Good to be with you.
Great to have you here.
Hi, Jim.
Just take a minute to introduce yourself, and then we'll continue on with our conversation.
Sure. Jim Lukaszewski. I'm based in Minneapolis. Was in New York for many years. My wife retired. She actually ran the businesses, so I'm working for an organization here called Risdall Marketing, and I have a little hangout in the back of the shop, so to speak, and we're still running the Lukaszewski Group, but as a division of this company, and my business remains pretty much the same, looking for trouble every day and trying to help out.
Great. So we're talking about companies taking positions on controversial societal types of issues. It's definitely a trend. I mean, I think this I've read enough reports and research to call it a bona fide trend. The Weber-Shandwick study that I referenced, the dawn of CEO activism, the study found that most people who see CEOs doing this think that the reason that the CEO is doing it is to get media attention. 21% say it's to build the CEO's reputation, and only 14% think it's because they want to do the right thing for society. Do we need to do pre-work with our stakeholders in order to lay the groundwork for CEO activism?
You asking me?
I'm asking anybody who wants to jump in. And by the way, I want to note to anybody who's watching live, I see we have people popping in and out, that you can ask a question over on the right-hand side of the screen. Just toss your question to us and we'll address it. So, yeah, anybody want to tackle that one?
I guess from my perspective, I think this is, I've not seen the study, but the study actually sort of resonates with me in terms of the numbers and the rationales for the numbers. I think we have, corporations have this a fairly level of low esteem, and so we have to demonstrate, prove, and somehow explain these things in some detail to why it's being done. Otherwise, it looks like it's PR, and that's what people think it is.
Yeah, I think that's one of the points that was made in that Robert Phillips book, Trust Me, PR is Dead, is that PR tries to make the organization look good, and I think he goes way too far when he says you won't need a PR organization at all, internal or external, if you just do good. The word will get out. But we need to avoid the perception that all we're doing is, as Phillips puts it, and a lot of other people have, putting lipstick on a pig.
Well, I think, we're talking about two different things. If we're talking about a CEO, an activist CEO doing things, and the PR people doing certain things, I think that the opportunity for trust is far more achievable by the CEO than it is by our profession, sad to say.
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about organizational values, and then the news ends up covering behavior that is inconsistent with the values we've been talking about.
That's all they care about.
Right. But I think there's an opportunity, and Leslie Gaines Ross, who's the chief reputation strategist at Weber Shandwick, has a great quote out of this study. It says, even if trying to make broader changes or protect employee rights, the message isn't getting communicated, the motivations behind why CEOs speak up have to be more clearly expressed if this trend continues. This, I think, is clearly where we have a role to play, and to work with the CEO to make sure that that those motivations are clearly expressed.
They had terrific core values, and they were well stated, well communicated, and no one could really argue with them. The problem is that the management team, the leadership team, paid no attention to them, and so the core values are important.
I just lost Ned. Just checking. George, can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. We're still live.
I hear you.
So how do we do this then? I mean, we're talking.
Can you hear me now?
I can. You're back. Thanks, Ned. So I guess the question is, let's talk tactics, because we're talking theoretically that it is in the organization's best interest to be transparent about our values and to show that alignment, to demonstrate that there are sincere motivations and not cynical motivations that are underlying the CEO's actions. What do we do? I mean, the answer clearly is not issuing a press release, right? Which I think is what a lot of people would be inclined to do, is say, here's why we're doing this, and
I just like to make the joke that most vision and value programs come in from an executive team at a golf outing on a napkin from the 19th hole. Somebody likes it, and it appears as wall posters, the following week. But in my experience, the only way this really works is when the CEO, his or herself, talks about this stuff all the time, and essentially requires that other people that work for him or her talk about these things as well, and try to relate business activity, whatever it is, to this set of core values. And it's kind of hard, because most core values are sort of really out there somewhere. I recently worked with a company that had a serious traffic accident. They're in the traffic, people moving business, and the CEO, the first inclination of the CEO was to go to the hospital because one person was in ICU and some other people were seriously injured. They sort of did this kind of extemporaneously, all on their own. The management team happened to be very together at the time, and when you heard the story, it was like, the kind of behaviors we expect of leaders is in the DNA of this company. And it's kind of like, why are you talking to me? You did everything right. The one thing he failed to do was to tell people what was done. So we had a management meeting about this, and the CEO opened the meeting by talking, and the owner as well, by walking through minute by minute what happened in this circumstance. And everybody was really amazed by hearing the entire story. We don't talk about this stuff. We have to explain it in detail. There have to be stories told that have self-evident punchlines and that sort of thing that bring the concepts and ideas to life. Otherwise, they're just more words that we push down the pipe on a piece of paper somewhere.
I'd like to follow up on that. I think that's extremely true. When leadership develops a vision, it needs to be based on the core values, and they need to socialize it within the organization so it's not the boss's idea, it's the company's idea. And then when they embrace it, the communications team needs to work with leadership to communicate what those values are and what the company's vision is. And the vision isn't what you think you are now, it's what you want to be in the future. And so you want the whole company to know what that is. So if the whole company buys into the vision and buys into those values, and they're aware of them, and because you continue to communicate, they understand them, and because you continue to communicate, they believe in them, and then because you continue to communicate, they act upon them, then good things will happen for the right reasons. And then you don't need to take credit for it through a press evident to people through the actions and deeds of the people of the company.
I think since my view is probably warped because I basically only work with people who are already in trouble. But what I've found is that PR is often not the organization. This is like PR being the conscience of an organization. I mean, you wouldn't write that down any place because it would just get a laugh. What I found is I try to find out who the CEO trusts, who does the CEO listen to. And quite often it's not the PR people or the HR people, it's somebody else in the organization, somebody who can get to him or her and say, look, Henry, you want this to work, you're going to have to talk about this. And it may not be the public relations person. I think if we really want this to work, we've got to think about how the management thinks, how they work, who they listen to, and then energize those people to get this done, if it's possible.
Yeah, actually, that has been written down.
But a lot of times,
the Melbourne Mandate.
A lot of times, they're going to listen to the lawyer.
I was going to say the Melbourne Mandate from the Global Alliance for Public Relations has been pretty explicit in saying that we're supposed to be the conscience of the organization. Not that anybody's read the Melbourne Mandate, but yeah. Ned, you were saying?
But a lot of times the CEO is listening to the lawyer, and the lawyer is saying, don't do anything. And a lot of times the CEO, the lawyer has the general counsel or whatever, has the ear of the CEO, and a lot of times they're saying, don't say anything.
It's really interesting. Jim, you probably know Helios Fred Garcia with the,
sure do.
The Logos Group, and he makes the point that lawyers are taught this in law school, that the way to minimize risk is to avoid saying anything. And what I heard Fred say is between not saying anything and mindless blather that'll get you in trouble, there's a lot of room for expressing the views of the organization and talking.
When I talk to people that I work with, I tell them, in fact, I'll be happy to share this memo. I have a memo for CEOs about who works for them and who they work for. And the memo makes the point that the lawyers work for you, not the reverse. And the issue with all these situations, especially this one, valuation advantage, are leadership issues. They're not legal issues. The subject comes up when we talk about apologizing. And there's this big bugaboo, but you can't apologize because it's an admission to things. Well, of course it is. But it's not a legal issue. It's a leadership issue. No lawyer can make this decision. Their canons of ethics prevent them from making these decisions. They can only advise their client. It's up to the person in charge to make these decisions based on their sense of leadership and their own internal working, so to speak. And it seems to comes as kind of a revelation, I think, to most people that lawyers are staff people just like us. And we give advice and they take it or they don't. Lawyers give advice for the most part and they take it or they don't. But as most issues that matter, they're leadership decisions, not legal decisions. I mean, they're leadership decisions, not legal decisions. And that's something we have to teach very strongly to people who run things. Their job is to lead and listen to advice from all kinds of important voices, but then make decisions based on what the situation calls for within the context of what we're talking about. Vision, values, ethics, and these other attributes of an organizational culture.
Let's take it back to the values discussion, because a lot of the CEO activism has nothing to do with crisis situations. It's just making a decision that we're going to get behind this particular issue and try to make the world a better place with whatever resources and power we have as an organization to do that. The values in an organization, Jim, as you said, they're often cobbled together on the executive retreat. I've worked with one organization where every employee wore the corporate values around their neck. Their security ID was on one side and the values were on the other. And I asked how important those values were in their day-to-day behavior, and they laughed in employee focus groups. And what they told me was, in one focus group, they said there's this guy, he was just promoted to executive vice president. He's got all the perks in the company car, all the reward that all of us crave, and he got there by violating every one of these. He blew his numbers away, got the promotion by violating every one of these statements on the values. So there's what's printed on the back of our ID cards, and then there's what will actually get us ahead. Guess which ones we're paying to. But when the values do inspire employees, if it makes them feel like I'm working for an organization whose values are consistent with my own, then it's easy to get your employees on board with these kinds of activist positions, isn't it? And can't you turn to your employees, or at least an employee advocacy group, to build the authenticity and the credibility of what the CEO is saying through their own actions, their own behaviors, their own engagements in their communities?
Well, I think it's obviously got to be more than just the CEO talking about an issue or engaged with it. It's really got to be something that the entire organization is working on that makes sense and is authentic because it's aligned with the capabilities and expertise of your organization. So, for example, Starbucks a couple of years ago rolled out a program that was ostensibly about getting people to talk about the very charged issue of race in Starbucks stores, and they got a lot of blowback on it. And they subsequently recalibrated and said, look, we think there's a real issue here we have to deal with as a society. What we can contribute to it as Starbucks is to start an intensive hiring effort to develop jobs for disadvantaged youth in a lot of the cities that we serve. And we need to be much more aggressive and focused as a company in doing this, because this is a value we bring to improving these conditions. So I think it's more than just an organization talking about an issue. You got to be able to do something about it. That's why I think the example that Ed mentioned earlier about Unilever and the hand washing campaign, sounds like a small thing for a soap producer to get involved in helping people learn how to wash their hands in a lot of countries around the developing world. But that basic sanitation is a huge, huge issue for millions of people around the world who have no access to the most basic ways to take care of themselves. And this is an area where a company like a Unilever can make a real difference, because they've got people in those countries that know about how to do public education campaigns, because they've got deep marketing expertise. They know how, they've got a sales network so they can reach into every small village and town in that country with those programs. So there's a lot of resources you bring to the table. And it's authentic. I'm willing to believe that the company wants to do something about it, because at the end of the day, it's going to help them sell some more soap. But who cares if they're helping raise the standard of living for people around the world? So that authenticity is critical, I think, to companies working on these issues. You don't want to just be seen as like another company spouting off on a generalized issue. It's like, okay, thank you for your opinion. There's a lot of opinions. What are you doing to affect change? And that's where I think, focusing on the areas where your organization really brings some specific expertise or insights to the table and then does real work around it is the key.
Yeah, isn't that what Target did, George, when they said in all our stores we're just going to have unisex bathrooms now? Whether you're on one side of that issue or the other, that's a tangible action that they've taken as opposed to just talking about it.
Yeah, I think it is a tangible action, and they obviously stepped into a very hot button political issue with that as part of it. But I think they felt, from what I've read about it, is that their interpretation of the law, as well as they have to provide those types of facilities to their own associates under federal law. So why wouldn't you provide it to customers? I think that's probably more of an issue, though, that it's anybody who's got a retail location is going to be dealing with the bathroom access issue. It's not really going to be much of an issue for your public issue if you're a manufacturing company. You don't have a lot of retail locations, or if you're a bank.
Right.
So I think some of that, just their position, just necessitated by the type of business they're in. And
I think there's often
sorry, Jim. Go ahead.
That's right. Part of the problem with this is that the people around these top people who have these ideas are surrounded by people who run the place by the numbers, and quite often, these great ideas are cause eyes to roll at the next level down. I call these the ladies in waiting, the folks who hope he stumbles tomorrow so I can get the job for a few hours. There's a lot of internal tension. A lot of these leaders who make these things happen are overcoming enormous internal, emotional, and political sort of barriers just to get this done by the very people who can make these things happen if they get on board. Target is a wonderful example because this is their culture from the start. They advertise, I don't know if they advertise nationwide, they probably do. They give like $4 million a day away to various things. They've slotted in this 5% rule. Pre-tax earnings thing, and it's a part of the culture. It's no surprise anybody who works at Target that these things happen. It's one of the reasons they work at Target. But it's new in a lot of organizations, what's happening, this trend that Shell is talking about. And I think a lot of people, especially in top management positions, are saying, there he goes again, for crying out loud. We're having a bad quarter, and he's worried about, holding meetings in Botswana or something for something that doesn't help us in Pittsburgh.
Jim, you raise a really interesting point. One of the results from the Weber-Shandwick study, and it's very consistent with at least a dozen other studies I've seen, is that millennials are especially drawn to CEO activism more than any other generation, and they say they'd be more loyal to an employer if the CEO spoke out on these controversial issues. So it seems to me that there's an employer branding component of this. If you're trying to attract the best of the generation that's currently the dominant generation in the workforce, that you'd want to be very public about these things.
Getting started is the hardest part, and one of Fred's great sayings is he considers himself more a management anthropologist than a communicator. And I think this is a pretty insightful comment because these things don't get started in PR because most of us don't study leadership, we study other stuff. To get these things and to get these things going, we keep talking about the jargon of our profession instead of the jargon of the folks who run the place, so to speak. It's really hard to develop the attention of an executive when we're talking about all this stuff that we talk about that we like so much, but it has nothing to do with convincing him to get it done.
Well, you have to be able to lay out a very clear path for the organization.
Shell, I had
Yeah, go ahead, George.
Oh, okay. Real briefly, I think you have to be able to lay out a very clear path for the organization on how and why you're engaging with issues, so that people have a context for what you're doing. You're not just doing something out of the blue. There's a reason why we're doing this, and we have a measure, we have a goal that we're looking to achieve over time, whether that's doing more investment in disadvantaged communities, contributing more resources to advancing certain social goals, achieving environmental goals in terms of reducing the environmental impact of our operations. All the elements of a long-term sustainability plan. A lot of things, I think people still think about sustainability plans and sustainability reports as largely being about environmental issues. But a huge amount of it is how you're engaged with these social issues and how you're going to measure your progress. So you've got to be able to articulate a goal over time, and then you've got to be able to communicate progress towards it so people see you making progress towards that. And what a lot of companies are doing too is they've also got external sustainability advisory boards of outside experts who will critique their own goals and progress. So as part of their annual sustainability report, you not only see a report on here's how we progressed against these environmental goals or these social goals, but there'll be commentary in there from the third-party outsiders saying, yeah, that's great, you did this in these areas, but here's where we think you could do some more. So I think the other thing we have to be willing to do is to be vetted and critiqued for what we're doing and take that input in and try to do better.
Ned, you were going to say something.
Shell, yeah, the role of the CEO. I gave a presentation in India a few years back, and one of the people in attending was the CEO of an airline. And I thought, this is because I now have a person you really want to influence about this issue of working with your communication staff to develop and socialize a vision and the core values. And who he had on his team responsible for communication. And I asked him the question, and he said, I'm responsible for communication. I'm the communicator for my airline. Now, granted, he had staff, an agency, but that attitude I really admired, because it was kind of the buck stops here. I just go ahead and assign important a sub-function to a staff functionary person. The other thing is George was kind of mentioning these social sustainability issues. They can not only affect the bottom line, they can affect huge areas of the world. I talked to a guy who was responsible for corporate social responsibility for a huge fast food company that we all know. And he said, we sell a lot of coffee, and we change suppliers in Central America. And it's a commodity, and we thought we could save a few pennies or something. Turns out, he said, when we did this, we didn't realize it, but we had a huge economic impact on thousands and thousands of small coffee plantation growers. And so he said, we really needed to think about that. Just as we wanted to save a few pennies, did we want to really cause that kind of economic hardship on an economy in Central America? And he also talked about something like filet of fish sandwiches. He started talking about how many filet of fish sandwiches they sell, and the impact that it was having on the North fish population. So it gets into the issue of understanding what your company is doing and being able to think about it and have a response about it, and maybe to act appropriately.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Ned. I know my very first job in the corporate world was with Arco in the mid-'70s. I think we were Fortune 12 when I joined the company, and they were the only oil company that had taken a position supporting the elimination of the oil depletion allowance. Everybody else said we want to continue to make this money from this benefit, and the view of the CEO and the president of Arco was, yeah, but this is the right thing to do, besides which it's going to happen anyway, and we'd like to be on the right side of history. Is it a problem that organizations are not looking at where these issues are going to bubble up and maybe come back and bite them in the ass at some point, and just decide to, bite the bullet, do the right thing? I'm thinking, for example, of Nestle, which took a lot of heat for being so slow about replacing the palm oil in some of its product that was contributing to the deforestation of the rainforest. And Mattel, there was an attack against Mattel because the packaging for the Barbie, the boxes that the Barbie doll came in, were coming out of the rainforest, and of course these are all suppliers. As you know, Mattel isn't out there making its own boxes. But should we be looking at the supply chain and being proactive in these kinds of sustainability issues, so that we can be the organization that those activists want to point to as the ones doing the right thing, even though it's going to cost money down the road? Do we put funds aside in order to be able to address these things?
I think this is really where recognizing that communication is a dialogue, the point that Ned raised earlier is key. This works really well when the organization gets engaged with the activist group to really find out what's on their mind. One example, this was one of my clients, Kimberly Clark, is a big producer of paper products. So everything that involves a lot of forest products going in as the raw material, everything from Kleenex tissues to Scott towels to Huggies diapers. So they can have, through their actions, a really big impact on sustainable sourcing of raw materials. And that's where they've worked with Greenpeace and others to get engaged in a conversation to say, okay, we think we can move to a certain level of recycled content or alternative fiber content in our products and reduce the stress on forests over a certain period of time. So we want to work with you so we understand where you think the goals are and how we can work with you and other NGOs to make things happen in the supply chain. And likewise, we hope out of the dialogue you understand what are the capital constraints on our business that affect our timetable for making these changes. So we're committed to making the changes that we both want to see, but we also need to understand that it can't necessarily all be done today. And before you have that kind of dialogue, there can be assumptions on both sides, the company side being, geez, these activists are being totally unreasonable, they don't understand our business, and the activists saying, hey, you don't understand the urgency of this issue and your role in dealing with it. So getting engaged in a conversation is always a good way to go. And I think, again, it comes back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. If you're guided by the lawyer saying, geez, don't talk to those people, they might sue us about something, you're never really going to get to engage in a discussion, a dialogue, and reach an agreement.
I think the
Shell,
culture, the leadership culture is not really one of what you're describing. It's still a culture of dollars and cents, and mine is bigger than yours. And they come out of management schools and management programs thinking they're invincible and that what they think really matters. And you really have to look and see what is the strategy to get these people interested in these sorts of things in the first place. And to get them to be in a position where they're going to say, okay, fine, I heard you, Henry. I understand the legal complications. We'll hire more lawyers, but we're going to do this anyway, or whatever it is. And when it comes to I think the idea of talking is always a sensationally important one. I think engagement with all parties is an extremely important part of resolving these issues, because they're not going to be resolved in court. They're going to be resolved essentially by people who have the power to resolve them. I think the hardest thing for management is to sit down with activist groups, NGOs, and others, and listen to the stuff these people talk about, and actually really try to have some kind of a conversation going forward. I think when I'm in these situations, and I am a lot because all my clients have somebody mad at them about something, is to sit down and begin talking. It's the hardest thing to get the people who want to meet a payroll every day to do. And it has to be some of them. It can't just be us, the staff people doing this. It has to be folks who make operating decisions every day. So they understand that the NGO is never going to understand our business. They don't care about us. They want things done their way. That's fine. But they also know the only way to get them done their way is to convince the person that they're dealing with by explaining or shaming or whatever techniques are used. To move the needle forward. And quite often, we don't do this until there's some catastrophic demand or catastrophic ultimatum that comes down, which forces people in positions of authority to begin thinking, well, let's do the calculus here and see, we got three ways to go. Which one is the one we're going to, I'm going to survive in, for one thing. But the other one is essentially which can have, in many respects, the least possible effect on the company. And it's or an organization, but get these people to settle down a bit about what we're doing and how we're doing it. It's an extraordinary experience to go through this, and it's very, very time-consuming. The problem with most management these days is they believe that everything has an endpoint, and the things that we're talking about at the moment have no endpoint. This is something that management has yet to learn, that the major issues of the day are going to be major issues of tomorrow, and tomorrow after that, and tomorrow after that. And it's a process of incrementalism, making agreements along the way. Some would satisfy us, and some would satisfy them. It's a whole different kind of management thinking than we teach today in management school. It's a problem.
George, you shared.
Shell, I'd like to add something to that.
Go ahead.
When we this idea of the second and third order effects, you could have a regulatory approval, you could have the license, you could have the law on your side, you could have the environmental impact study completed, everything could be approved, and yet if there can some organizations that have some impact stand in the way, what they call this, what's been referred to as social license to do what you want to do. I talked to the harbor master of a port in British Columbia, and he was telling me about situations where he's had bands of First Nations, or he's had local community groups that, even though what he planned to do was with the law, was fully permitted, what had met all aspects of the environmental impact study, he was within his legal and regulatory jurisdiction to do it, but the community didn't want him to do it. And so he still had to deal with that and understand their objections and be able to work through that. And that can be something that's not even on your front doorstep. In one case, we've got a port that has all the permissions to ship crude oil to Asia from Canada, and yet this particular port right now, the new prime minister ran on a crude oil shipments from the west coast of Canada. So even though the port has been developed and it's all permitted and the environmental impact studies are done, they can't proceed because now they have a government that says, well, we're against it. So now you have to kind of go back to ground zero, and you have to try to work through those objections, even though you have all the other regulatory approval to do them.
Here's the problem. The idea of a social license is a fiction created by corporates. Actually, a corporate PR guy from a mining company in this part of the United States invented the concept. But it's total nonsense. It's issuing a license to yourself by yourself, and you do it by doing studies and all kinds of, and gathering of data, which makes everybody angry, because the studies that we do are designed to do one thing, and that's to tell people who are involved emotionally that you're too stupid to understand, but we've got the data to prove what we can do. The issue for all these organizations, especially for the ones in the controversial industries, is that that's the wrong notion. The notion is permission. We have to seek permission to do things from the public. It's a different thought process than going out and doing all these studies and saying, because all these numbers add up to whatever they add up to, we now have a social license which we confer on ourselves to get us to do that. And I'll tell you why this is the truth. I define truth. In fact, I'm writing a book about this called Waging Peace in Your Community. But it's based on a definition of truth that goes like this. Truth is, I define as 15% facts and data, and 85% emotion and point of reference. And the problem with data is, it ignores the most powerful things that man can generate, and that's emotion. We do everything, business does everything it can to avoid talking to people, the dialogue we talked about earlier, where we can actually, sweat a little bit in front of each other and work these things out. But instead, somebody asks a question, somebody does a study as an answer, and the study says essentially, hey, we're smart, we're doing a study, sit down, put your hand down, and let us do what we want to do. It's not working anymore. Yep. There has to be a whole different mental set change here about how we relate to these publics. The Canadian pipeline in the United States was defeated because the oil company involved for Canadians was the most arrogant piece of organization I've ever seen and had the occasion to touch base with. They believed they could do it because for all those crazy reasons they kept talking about. But not really once did they settle down to figure out, to start having that kind of dialogue we talked about earlier, because it takes time and all sorts of stuff, but and costs a lot of money, and you have to work with all of these very strange people. But that's how you get permission to do things. And companies start with tremendously unrealistic goals. I go to planning meetings and they talk about oil is going to flow in 18 months, and my question is, have you ever done this before? I mean, you're going to over area, and something's going to happen by the end of 18 months. You'll be lucky if you get a spade in the ground in the next 10 years, by getting started. But they don't want to hear that. They still move forward in these sort of idealistic ways with concepts like social license, which doesn't pass the straight face test.
Okay. Well, it's the top of the hour, so we are out of time. For those who've been watching live, thank you for joining us. Of course, this will be available both as a video and an audio podcast. The podcast distributed through the FIR Podcast Network. You can subscribe so you automatically get every episode of these each month. Next month, we're talking about employee engagement, so I think there's kind of a connection between this topic and next month. So until then, hey, panel, Ned, George, Jim, thank you so much for taking the time out today. Really appreciate it, and hope everybody has a great rest of their week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shel.